Well, we welcome everybody here again tonight, and we are going to begin we're going to continue, I should say, our series, 66 Books in 52 Weeks. We are now up to the first of the prophets, and that is the prophet Isaiah. And we're going to just take a look at this. It's 66 chapters in this book, so we have a lot of ground to cover tonight, but I think it'll be something that we will enjoy here together. So let's just begin. Hopefully you have your outlines there. We have several that are available here in the room, and you can download those in the description or in the email that you got sent out for the Zoom link, or in the description of this video. If you're watching it on YouTube, you can download the video from that. So let's just begin. We'll just jump right into the book of Isaiah, and we'll start with our the overview that we have, that you can get those printouts there. There's instructions on that on your outlines there. But the first part of this, we are at the 23rd book in the Bible there, and it is 66 chapters. And Isaiah served under 4 of the Judean kings. That would be in the south. So he served in the southern kingdom, and he basically was a prophet who warned of the coming judgment, and so he also is responsible for some of the most famous of the prophecies in the Old Testament, and we'll see those in just a moment here. The other overview here, and again, this is just from those printouts that you can purchase, or you can come into the church and just pick up. We'll print them out for free. This is the way the handout has it. You have 3 sections here, the way it's lined out here. You have, first of all, the sins of the kingdoms, and Isaiah teaches repentance to the people and calls out for repentance from their sins, names what they've done, names what the foreign nations have all done, and then he predicts the restoration of Judah after the exile, and then he goes on to talk about a new heaven and a new earth. And a lot of these prophecies will have a double meaning to them, or a double fulfillment, in that they would be fulfilled in their day, but they would also be fulfilled at the end of days. So you've got a book with 66 chapters in it. It's going to be a little bit of a challenge to pick out a key verse, but this is the one I chose here. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. That's one of the most famous ones out of Isaiah, that is predicting the ministry of Jesus Christ. So Isaiah 53 and verse 6. And so hopefully we can get a good overview, and when you go to read this on your own, this resource here will help you have a better understanding of what you're reading when you do read it here. So let's just begin by, first of all, just talking about prophets and the books of prophecy. So this is from a person I like to read a lot of his books or listen to his commentaries, as J. Vernon McGee. He puts it this way, says, although the predictive element bulks large in this section, the prophets were more than just fortune tellers. Actually, they were men raised up of God in a decadent day, when both priest and king were no longer worthy channels through whom the expression of God might flow. These men not only spoke of events in the far-off future, but also spoke of local events in the immediate future. Now, I want to just once again remind you from back in Deuteronomy, what were some of the requirements that were expected of somebody that was a prophet of God. And so let me just read this to you. This is Deuteronomy 18, verses 20 through 22. And this is what it says. But a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything I have not commanded, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods, is to be put to death. You may say to yourselves, how can we know when a message has not been spoken by the Lord? What if a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not if what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true, that is a message the Lord has not spoken. that prophet has spoken presumptuously. Do not be alarmed. So the number one thing is, if a prophet spoke in that day and what he proclaimed did not come true or was proven to be false, then you could know that that was indeed a false prophet. Also, if they were speaking on behalf of a false god, you would know that that was a false prophet. Perhaps you have seen this statement before. What was the job of a prophet? And this is on your outline if you want to fill that in. The job of a prophet was to foretell, that they would talk about future events, but really, mostly what they do is they forthtell, Forthtell, the truth. They foretell and forthtell the truth. And so forthtelling simply means we're going to talk about the here and now. Here's the condition things are in Israel. Here are the condition things are in the foreign lands and all the different lands here. So this is the job of a prophet, and this was the job of Isaiah, and he did both of them. He told the future, but he also laid it out. He said, here's the truth for right now, Israel. Here's what you need to know. My home minister put it this way. He said, this was Glenn David Vaughn, who I grew up with. I read one of his lessons on this. He said, Isaiah is the first of 17 books of prophecy in the Old Testament. Now, 5 of the prophets in the Old Testament are called major prophets, and 12 of the prophets are called minor prophets. So you know what the difference between a major prophet and a minor prophet is. The major prophets were over 18, and the minor prophets were no, that's not right. I'm making that up. The only difference is it's the size of their writings. So the major prophets had, we got 66 chapters here. So Isaiah is one of the major prophets. There's 5 of the major prophets and 12 of the minor prophets. And generally they're in order in the Bible by length of book, but also somewhat by when they wrote, although not exactly. You kind of bounce back and forth in the dates and stuff of when they're in there. But that's basically how the prophets are organized, the books of prophecy are organized in the Bible here. So let's talk about the background of Isaiah here. So the author, who was Isaiah? Well, first of all, the name Isaiah means the salvation of Jehovah. He certainly did speak of that, and he certainly did prophesy about that. Interesting here, and I've got some references to that. He was married to a prophetess, did have at least 2 sons. One of his sons, my favorite names is Maher-shalal-hash-baz. So I like that. I don't think, I forget exactly what the meaning is. It's a dark meaning to the name, but it just flows off the tongue, doesn't it? So anyway, he also prophesied in the southern kingdom. Remember, the north is Israel, the south is Judea. And so he prophesied during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So we've seen this handy-dandy chart of all the kings of Israel. So if you want to know when Isaiah ministered, it was about at that time where he ministered there under the time of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, and then Manasseh would have been in that time as well. So those are the kings where the time period in which he served. It is thought that Isaiah's death may be referred to in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11 is known as the Faith Hall of Fame, where by faith, Hebrews, the writer talks about all the things that people did in days of old by faith. And let me just read to you this. This is Hebrews 11:37 through 39. It says, "They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These all were commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised." So it has been thought that Isaiah was killed by the evil king Manasseh. and that he might have been one of those ones that was sawn in two or something like that. He may have very much suffered a very horrific death, and so he likely did meet his death under that evil king Manasseh. So this is why we refer to that Hebrews chapter 11. A lot of people think that that's, even though his name's not mentioned there, but that it's kind of pointing towards Isaiah in that Hebrews chapter 11. So
these numbers after the names, are those the years of these?
yes, the question is asked, the numbers after the names of the kings there, that's the number of years that they served. And there's a couple that says like 3 months or 2 or 3 months or something like that, or 1 month. But the numbers there are years.
If you add those up, that's 150 years.
Yep, that's well, it wouldn't have been for all of that time. He would have died under Manasseh's time. So it would have been those first 3 kings there that he would have been a part of there. So the first 4 kings, that is. So that's quite a bit of time, and he lived a long life. But it looks like he was killed under the rule of Manasseh there. So, so let me move on up here. So just a few little facts about the book of Isaiah. Now, this is something that's important to know because you might hear this whenever you hear somebody doing a study about this, and that is the multiple author theory. It's a false notion that the book of Isaiah was written by multiple writers, as many as 3. And so where does this come from? These claims come out of a scholarly, liberal scholars it's a scholarly denial of predictive prophecy. So you have scholars that just do not believe in predictive prophecy or anything like that at all, say that just can't be. And so since they don't believe in prophecy, they reason, well, Isaiah himself could not have predicted the future, so there must have been multiple writers, one who wrote about the things after they happened and as if they were predicting them before they happened. So that was the one theory there, and that was a pretty popular one there. However, one thing that has greatly aided in dispelling that myth is the Great Isaiah Scroll. Now, this is part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The reason that archaeological find is so important, and here's a picture from the Great Isaiah Scroll, that contains all 66 chapters of Isaiah. So, when was this dated? This manuscript? This manuscript dates back to 125 BC, 125 years before Christ. And a manuscript is simply a copy, where a scribe copied from you had the original written, and then over the years, scribe after scribe after scribe would meticulously copy the original manuscript. Now, eventually, all the original manuscripts would be destroyed and not survive over the centuries. But then you have these old manuscripts, and so the older the manuscript, the more reliable. But this is proof that these prophecies predated Christ, at least by 125 years. But we can see here that it's showing that this is really strong evidence that Isaiah was the writer. It was one writer making prophecy inspired by God. Major theme in the book of Isaiah, it repeats over and over again, and that is judgment and redemption. God judges his people, God judges wrongdoing, but he also grants hope. So there is some real strong judgment and chastising of sin, and there is some, at the same time, there is real hope that is provided for those that would seek to turn their hearts back to God. And then there's an ultimate hope for God's providence in working through the coming Messiah. So, okay, so let's get through all of Isaiah here, the outlines. What I thought I'd do, it's just 66 chapters, so I would just start in verse 1, and we'll just read the whole thing. No, we won't do that, but we'll just go through here. I've got some highlights, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll just have an idea of what's in this book. So we're going to begin the first section, chapters 1 through 39, basically covers the subject of the Lord's judgment. And it goes country by country or item by item. And so all of these different things here, you can see God's judgment. First of all, you have God's judgment on Judah and Israel. So let me just share with you some messages of judgment here. Now on the screen, and I think maybe on your outline there, there's the verses that I'm going to be reading here, and we'll be skipping through here. We'll begin in Isaiah chapter 1, beginning in verse 2, right at the beginning of the book. Hear me, you heavens, listen, earth, for the Lord has spoken. I reared children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. It's talking about Israel, all right? The ox knows its master, the donkey knows its manger, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand. Woe to the sinful nation, a people whose guilt is great, a brood of evildoers, children given to corruption. They have forsaken the Lord. They have spurned the Holy One of Israel and turned their backs on him. Well, I don't think he minced words there, did he? This is so skip down to verse 7 in chapter 1. Your country is desolate, your cities burned with fire, your fields are being stripped by foreigners right before you, laid waste as when overthrown by strangers. Daughter Zion is left like a shelter in a vineyard, like a hut in a cucumber field, like a city under siege. Unless the Lord Almighty had left some survivors, we would have become like Sodom. We would have been like Gomorrah. So one of the things that's interesting here, and this is a great example of this, is sometimes prophets would write a prediction and they would write it as if it had already happened. Isaiah is predicting the future here, but he's writing it as if it has already happened. So your countries are laid, this is coming. Your fields are laid bare. These awful things are happening. But he's writing it as if it's already happened. And that's again to show that the confidence in the message. So here's another one here, Isaiah chapter 2, beginning in verse 10. Go into the rocks, hide in the ground from the fearful presence of the Lord and splendor of his majesty. The eyes of the arrogant will be humbled and human pride brought low. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day. The Lord Almighty has a day in store for all the proud and lofty, for all that is exalted, and they will be humbled. So there's that message of judgment. At the same time, there is a message of hope sprinkled throughout these chapters here. Let me just read to you here from Isaiah chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Come, descendants of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord. So this is a message of hope sprinkled in with these proclamations, confronting of sin and proclamations of judgment. In chapter 7, there is the famous prediction of the birth of Christ. Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14. This, I'm sure, will sound very familiar if you're around church at Christmas time. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel. So you have this prediction of Jesus coming. Again, we know from the archaeological evidence that at the very least, this was written 125 years before Christ. So something miraculous is about this book. We know it was much earlier than that, but archaeological evidence proves that it was written 125 years before Christ. So that was God's judgment of Judah and Israel. And so that's chapters 1 through 12. Now, if you go through chapters 13 through 23, you have God's judgment on the surrounding nations. You see, it's not only Israel that God is concerned about. He is concerned about all people, and he is concerned about their sins as well. And so we'll just go through all of these. We won't go into detail, but God's judgment to the surrounding nations, he calls out Babylon, and then he calls out Moab, where the Moabites would have been. He calls out Damascus, and then Cush, which is in the upper Nile region, Egypt, and then again Babylon, Edom, and Arabia. And then the Valley of Vision, which was Isaiah chapter 22, which is also Jerusalem. And so that's intermingled in there too, even though that's part of Israel, or Judah, I should say. So God calls out judgment against the sins of all these nations and concludes with Jerusalem. And so what we learn here is, even though the Jews were set apart for a special purpose, God shows no favoritism. In fact, Jerusalem is even more guilty because they were given direct revelation from God. They were more responsible for their actions than even these other places, but God calls out the detestable actions of all of these nations through Isaiah. So as you read through this, it kind of gets repetitive after a while. You know, woe to you, Cush, or woe to you, Egypt, and it goes through listing all of these things, and you go reading this, it feels repetitive, but there is a method to this, and this is what Isaiah is doing. So, once again, we have another thing, God's message of devastation, praise, and deliverance. That's Isaiah chapter 24 through 27. So, one of the things you'll see in some of these books of prophecy is you'll have the same theme repeated several times. It's because they're trying to get their point home. It's not just a new thing after another, one new statement after another. It is repeating it, maybe saying it in a different way, going back and reviewing again, and Isaiah is doing some of that here. So here's God's message of devastation, praise, and deliverance. Well, here's some examples of the devastation. If you look at Isaiah 24, beginning in verse 1. See, the Lord is going to lay waste the earth and devastate it. He will ruin its face and scatter its inhabitants. It will be the same for the priest as for people, as master as for servant, for mistress as for her servant, for seller as for buyer, for borrower as for lender, for debtor as for creditor. The earth will be completely laid waste and totally plundered. The Lord has spoken his word. So there is some ideas that some bad times are coming. This is what Isaiah is predicting in this day. But then sprinkled amongst that were words of praise. Isaiah 25, beginning in verse 1. Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you and praise your name. For in perfect faithfulness you have done wonderful things planned long ago. You have made the city a heap of rubble, the fortified town a ruin, the foreigner's stronghold a city no more. It will never be rebuilt. Therefore, strong peoples will honor you. Cities of ruthless nations will revere you. So it's a way of saying ultimately everybody will bow their knee to the Lord. Everybody will humble themselves before God. And then there's the message of hope or deliverance, that this judgment is also comes with a hope of being delivered from it. Isaiah 26, beginning in verse 1. In that day, this song will be sung in the land of Judah. We have a strong city. God makes salvation its walls and ramparts. Open the gates that the righteous may enter, the nation that keeps faith. You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they trust you. Trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord himself is rock eternal. Isn't it interesting that some of these things, you hear this, it sounds a little bit like some of the statements you might hear in the New Testament in the book of Revelation. In that day, and it's talking about that day, we will ever be with the Lord forever. You can see some of that imagery right here. So there's judgment, there's praise to God, and then there are some passages talking about God's deliverance. Okay, once again, you can see we have themes that are kind of circular. They are repeating again and again. That's why you might feel like as you read Isaiah, it feels a little repetitive, but it's by design. Like you say, sometimes we don't need to be taught, we just need to be reminded. And that's what was going on here. So that brings us to the next one, God's declaration of woe to Israel, Jerusalem, and to the nation. So Isaiah is laying out here, why is it that God is going to bring judgment upon the nation of Israel? Well, Isaiah chapter 30, beginning in verse 1. Woe to the obstinate children, declares the Lord, to those who carry out plans that are not mine, forming an alliance, but not by my spirit, heaping sin upon sin, who go down to Egypt without consulting me, who look for help to Pharaoh's protection, to Egypt's shade for refuge. But Pharaoh's protection will be your shame. Egypt's shade will bring you disgrace. So there is in this woe to Israel, Jerusalem, and the nations here, you see Jerusalem at this time, God is calling them out for seeking false comfort or false security. They thought that they could find some security by running back to Egypt or running and finding security there, but that is not what they need. They need to turn back to God with their whole heart to prevent this judgment. There's a message to the nations. In Isaiah 34, verses 1 and 2, so God is calling out Israel, but he's also calling out all people. Come near, you nations, and listen and pay attention, you peoples. Let the earth hear and all that is in it, the world and all that comes out of it. The Lord is angry with all nations. His wrath is on all their enemies. He will totally destroy them. He will give them over to slaughter. Now that's a real happy thought there, isn't it? Not to get way ahead, but in the New Testament book of Romans, it's interesting. If you look at the first three chapters of Romans is just nothing but bad news, pointing out the depravity of humanity. And then Paul points out how guilty all the Jews are. And then he says how guilty all the Gentiles are. And then the next chapter is how guilty we all are. It doesn't matter. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And here you have Isaiah, the Jews, the Gentiles, they've all rebelled against God. And we all stand before God in need of, worthy of judgment, guilty of sin and worthy of judgment here. But in the midst of that, there is a message of hope. So, Isaiah 35, and I'm going to read, this is an extended one, it says 10 verses here. Isaiah 35, beginning in verse 1 through 10. The desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God. Strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way, and say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf be unstopped. And then will the lame leap like a deer and the mute tongue shout for joy, and water will gush forth in the wilderness, streams in the desert. The burning sand will become a pool, and the thirsty ground of bubbling springs, and the haunts where jackals once lay, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow. And a highway will be there. It will be called the way of holiness. It will be for those who walk on that way. The unclean will not journey on it, Wicked fools will not go about on it. No lion will be there, nor any ravenous beast. They will not be found there, but only the redeemed will walk there. And those the Lord has rescued will return. They will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. Yes, there is judgment, but there is also hope. You can see there's judgment, but there's also redemption that is available. And that brings us to the next part, the last part of the book in the outline there, and that would be the Lord's redemption. And so this is where we're going to be ending on some more hopeful things. So it's interesting how in the book of Romans, in the New Testament, chapters 1, 2, and 3 is a bunch of bad news. The rest of the book talks about, okay, here's the solution for that. So you don't really understand how good the good news is until you understand how bad the bad news is. So this is where we come into the Lord's redemption, beginning in chapter 40. First of all, we have God is pictured as a comforter and a helper in Isaiah 40 and 41. And so let me just read to you from Isaiah 40, beginning in verse 1. Comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her, her hard service has been completed, and that her sin has been paid for, and that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain shall be made low. The rough ground shall become level, the rugged places plain. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Any of those words sound familiar? Very familiar. It was one of the ones of the one calling in the wilderness. That was looking forward to Jesus later revealed. That was John the Baptist, the one who called in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord. So God is pictured as a comforter and as a helper in Isaiah 40 and 41. Now we see that God is pictured as a servant. We're starting to get some of these messianic images. Now let me define that again in case you're wondering what that word means. What is a messianic prophecy? A messianic prophecy is simply a Jesus prediction. When he's talking about Jesus, those are messianic predictions there. So that's what that means, Messiah, predictions about the Messiah. So this whole section, very strong messianic themes or Jesus predictions in these passages here. So let me just read to you a couple of key ones here. There's one here, Isaiah 42, beginning in verse 1. Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establish justice on earth. In his teaching the islands will put their hope. And then we'll look here at Isaiah 53, and I think it's good for us to just read this extended passage here together. Isaiah 53, and we'll just do those first 12 verses there. And I want you just to think about this. This is a message of comfort. We know it now as a prediction about Jesus. Think of it in terms of those that knew that judgment was coming, but that one day there would be redemption here. Isaiah 53, beginning in verse 1. Who has believed our message, and to whom the arm of the Lord has been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that was brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearer is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of this generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper his hand. And after he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied by his knowledge. My righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sins of many, and made intercessions for the transgressors. You know, the hindsight's 2020, and we look back on that, and we see the suffering servant of Christ. We see it as Christ, but we see here that in this day, they would see that God is not just a God of judgment, but that he is looking to provide a way to have our sins taken care of. So that's just really, I just find that very moving there. And so now we're down to the final one here, that God now is pictured as a forgiving Father. That's Isaiah 55 and 56. This forgiving Father invites his wayward and backsliding people to repent and seek his forgiveness. And now again, these passages I'm reading, I've got a feeling they sound very familiar to us, because they are sprinkled all through the New Testament. These are fulfilled in the life of Jesus here. Isaiah 61, beginning in verse 1. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide to those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. So this is just a moving book. And I realize we have gone at lightning speed here to get through the book of Isaiah here. But there is the, what we have as far as just that whole prophecy, the whole book there, the whole idea behind it. And as I look at that, please correct me. I think that's supposed to be Isaiah 66, 1 through 3 there that I've put up on the screen. But you can correct that later, look that up later. I think I put the wrong chapter there by accident, typo. So, well, let's consider now, what are the lessons that we can learn from this prophetic book? Now, I will say this. There are some pretty strong words that Isaiah says here, but then also some words of comfort. Buckle up for next week as we look at Ezekiel. That guy was interesting. And the way he spoke was interesting. And just some of the things that he did. But let me go. The first lesson here on this is predictive prophecy is one proof that the Bible is indeed the Word of God. So that this is not just some made-up novel, that there was something supernatural about it, that hundreds of years, centuries before the time of Christ, you would have these predictions. Even in that last passage we just read, it was the prediction of how Jesus would be buried, and actually his tomb and how that all worked out. And Jesus actually read from that passage when he said, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor." He went to the synagogue one day and read that verse and said, "This is fulfilled today." And the audience there didn't like that too much. They said, "What are you claiming to be God? You claim to be the Messiah?" And he wasn't very much well received on that day. But predictive prophecy is one proof that the Bible is indeed the Word of God. And finally, God exhibits justice and grace simultaneously. So God does exhibit both of those things. And if you want to see the best example of that, if you ever wonder about God's mercy, or if you ever wonder how serious God takes sin, the best example of how justice and grace meet would be at the cross itself. Because even in what we were reading here earlier, where he took on the sins of the people, so that's justice. He accepted the penalty. He fulfilled justice, Jesus did, by going to the cross. And then also in the cross, as you look at it, you can see grace. God demonstrates his love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He was a volunteer, not a victim. And so, as we said, I've tried to make it very clear where you can see Jesus in every one of these books of the Bible. And very clearly, you can see Jesus in this predictive book of prophecy, the book of Isaiah.